Cooper on the Case. A Masonic Authors Guild International production.
Welcome to another episode east of Eden, Jalama Beach, Santa Barbara County, California, June 1997. I had driven the RV from Phoenix, Arizona on Interstate 10 and then on to the 101 through Los Angeles, the highway to hell according to the receptionist at the RV park. What was I doing there, you may well ask. I had studied a friend's Rand McNally map, no GPS in those days. It would have been a good idea to have bought my own copy to take with me. All I knew was that if I drove west, I would eventually come across the Pacific Ocean. I did not realize that eventually could be a long time. The first evening, I watched almost mesmerized as the Pacific surf pounded the beach. I had a battered and torn copy, some of the first pages were missing, of John Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat that I had bought in a thrift store for 25 cents. I knew nothing of the man other than what little could be gleaned from the novel, which was nothing. Little did I know that Steinbeck was soon to play a part in my continuing journey, and that he would continue to be part of my life to this day. From Jalama, I travelled north on Route 1, the Big Sur, towards San Francisco, and on the way meeting many different people, including a fellow Scot who tried to tap me for a few bucks. I dined in various taverns and sampled the local beers, frequently. Heading north was the wrong way to drive the Big Sur. I was constantly looking over my shoulder to catch sight of the magnificent views. Next time I'll drive north to south. Some days later I found myself in Salinas. I had a vague thought that this had some connection with Steinbeck, and then I stumbled across the National Steinbeck Center in downtown Salinas. The centre is dedicated to the life and work of John E. Steinbeck, born 1903, died 1968, and his gritty novels which include Cannery Row, Of Mice and Men, Grapes of Wrath, and of course East of Eden, to which this podcast is dedicated. At this time I was still a young Mason, and the last thing on my mind was Freemasonry. When I visited the centre, I noticed just after the entrance doors there was a small display window containing a book and a caption stating that this was the commonplace book, a kind of notebook, journal and diary, that had belonged to Steinbeck's father, John Ernst Steinbeck, 1862 to 1935. On the cover was a badge of some sort, but what it was did not register with me at first. Having spent some time looking at the exhibits, I especially liked Rocinante, the camper van in which Steinbeck had driven around the US together with his dog Charlie during 1960, which he described in his book Travels with Charlie, In Search of America, which was published in 1960. My drive from Phoenix to San Francisco could not compete with his Travels with Charlie, but in a small way it helped me better understand Steinbeck. While musing on his Travels with Charlie, it suddenly struck me that the badge on the commonplace book was Masonic. I retraced my steps and confirmed that it was a lapel pin in the form of a square, compasses and letter G, and had been carefully mounted and centred on the front cover of the book. As a matter of professional courtesy, I introduced myself as a fellow curator from across the pond. Initially warm and welcoming, when I mused, out loud, that as Steinbeck's father was obviously a Freemason and that perhaps Steinbeck Jr. himself was also a Freemason, the curator abruptly found that he had other things to do. I was puzzled by this sudden reaction, his rush to do something else, at the mention of Freemasonry, but as a young Freemason, as I was then, I had never come across a Masonophobe before, and so I put his brush off as being down to some kind of emergency on the part of my fellow curator. But the thought that Steinbeck might have been a Freemason remained with me, and something to be followed up at a later date. That turned out to be years later. It was only later, when I was researching for my book on the Order of Free Gardeners, that I remembered Steinbeck's novel East of Eden, and of course the Garden of Eden was very important to the Free Gardeners. If there were allusions to the Free Gardeners, even if only in my mind, I wondered if there were any Masonic references in any of his novels. Speed reading his novels for this episode of Cooper on the Case, I did not, sadly, find any such references. Had there been, it would have perhaps encouraged me to speed up my so far casual research, but that does not mean that there are no references in his novels, and now I shall embark on a careful re-reading of them. If anything relating to Freemasonry is found, I shall report the details on Magi. San Francisco was my final destination on this trip, and was where the rental RV would be returned. The Grand Lodge of California has jurisdiction over Masonic lodges in that state, and it was natural to visit Freemasons Hall on Nob Hill a couple of days after the Steinbeck Center. To the receptionist, I explained the reason for my visit, but there was no one available to speak to me at that time, but I was welcome to leave my name and address and the nature of my inquiry. This I duly did, but I never heard anything further. However, I blame myself, because I had left as my address my email address, and this was at a time when the vast majority of correspondence was still being done by sending letters through the mail. It was only years later that there was time to reignite my interest in whether Steinbeck was a Freemason, and that was, as mentioned earlier, on rereading his novel East of Eden. I knew that he lived in Monterey and worked on nearby farms, such as Post's Ranch, and so I convinced myself that if he had been a Freemason, he would have been a member of the Monterey Lodge Number 217. Unfortunately, the lodge secretary confirmed that he had never been a member there. A dead end. That put my inquiries on hold for some time, whilst I did some more background reading, but meantime I had become acquainted with my opposite number at the Grand Lodge of California, Adam Kendall, who has been a guest on a Magi Circle discussion, and he agreed to investigate on my behalf. At my suggestion, he checked the membership records of Monterey Lodge and confirmed that the lodge secretary had been correct. Steinbeck had not been a member of that lodge. My background reading soon made me realise that I had made an elementary error in thinking that Steinbeck would have joined the lodge nearest to where he lived and worked. That was in and around Monterey. The Steinbeck family had lived in Salinas for several generations, and before I could contact Adam with this new information, he beat me to the punch. Steinbeck was a member of Salinas Lodge Number 204. What's more, so too had his father and grandfather been members of that lodge. Steinbeck was initiated on the 1st of March, passed on the 12th of April, and raised on the 24th of May 1929. This was the year his first novel was published, The Cup of Gold, which was loosely based on the pirate Henry Morgan, and particularly his raid on Panama Viejo, or Old Panama, which took place in 1671. In 1930 he wrote Murder at Full Moon, but Steinbeck refused to have this published because he considered it to be of poor quality. The Pastures of Heaven was published in 1932, and in 1933 Steinbeck published The Red Pony. After 1933, Steinbeck does not seem to have been active within Freemasonry, but this is hardly surprising, as he was now set on a career as a writer, and was already working on the novel that first brought him to international attention, Tortilla Flat. Ultimately, this started him on a course that led him to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. I do not think that there are many lodges that have had a Nobel Prize winner for literature as a member, unless you know otherwise. Conclusion: this exercise, over many years, taught me some important lessons. First of all, when you get an idea, write it down before it is forgotten. That is what a commonplace book is for. Just as well I have a good memory, because the commonplace book method doesn't work for me. I've got 8 of them lying around the house, and none of them are anywhere near full. Another lesson was to speak to others, and hopefully you will meet enthusiasts and helpful people such as Adam Kendall. Don't be put off by Masonophobes or other people's poor attitudes. Most of all, don't give up. Keep tuning in for more of Cooper on the Case.
Cooper on the Case. This podcast is for educational purposes and perhaps entertainment. While the Masonic Authors Guild International provides the most accurate information possible, listeners use the information at their own risk. This podcast and its contents are Magi's properties, as are all the opinions and information it presents. Robert L.D. Cooper, Mark A. Tabberson, any other speakers' views and opinions within the podcast do not represent nor speak for Freemasonry, any Masonic organization, their former or current employers in any way, shape, or form. Magi, Cooper, or Tabbert will not compensate you in any way whatsoever if you happen to ever suffer an inconvenience due to the information herein contained.